Welcome to REDtalks, the brand new interview series that we are launching that's going to take an in-depth look at the issues that matter most to the people of Ontario. Now, today is the first in our series, and there will be many more interviews coming up over the coming weeks and months. But I'm very excited about the special guest who's agreed to join us for today's conversation, and that's Sharleen Stewart. Sharleen currently serves as the president of SEIU Canada. SEIU Canada is a labor union that represents thousands of women and men who work as personal support workers, often called PSWs, and they are literally on the front lines providing care in Ontario's long-term care homes. In the past number of days, we've all been horrified by the stories that have emerged about the circumstances that both residents in those homes and the workers have experienced during this pandemic. It's a tragic story, and I'm really delighted that today we're going to have a chance to shine a light on what Sharleen and her members are experiencing firsthand. But there is something else that I do want to touch upon in today's conversation. And that's that though there are thousands of PSWs doing extraordinary work in Ontario every single day, so many of them are women. And they are people who are far too often marginalized in our economy and our society. For example, of the 3 PSWs who have so far tragically died because of COVID-19, all are women, all are over the age of 50, and all are people of color. And so as part of our conversation today, I'm really hoping that Sharleen and I can jump into this and figure out exactly what we need to do as individuals, as a society, in our economy to make sure that going forward, yes, we deliver the kind of care that's needed so that people who are aging have dignity and are healthy and safe at all times, but also to make sure that those people who are on the front lines providing the care and support that's needed have everything that they need in order to reach their potential. And so I'm looking forward to this. Let's get the conversation started. I'm delighted to be joined by Sharleen Stewart. How are you doing?
Very good, Stephen. Thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations on your series. This is exciting to hear of a REDtalks. I'll make sure that I tune in and see if you can match the beat.
I really appreciate that. Obviously we're going to jump into what we've seen, the tragedies that we've seen over the last number of weeks through the pandemic, in particular, the truly horrifying report produced by the Canadian Armed Forces in just a quick second. But if you don't mind helping our viewers get a better handle on how you came to be in the role that you're in, a little bit of your own personal background, I think that'd be really, really helpful to set the frame.
Okay, thank you. It seems like forever ago, really, that I did receive the honor of becoming president of these amazing workers, and it truly is an honor. I guess it's just, I grew up with a family of 6 kids, 2 brothers that were always getting into trouble, so their big sister always had to fight them out and negotiate detention after school, and being the eldest of those 6 too, obviously, I think put me in the position of always taking care of people and wanting to make sure that everybody was safe and got what they deserved. 2 very strong, active parents that raised us to obviously always stand up for what's right. So I guess that's led me to this path, and my experience over the decades have been so rewarding for me to meet the people that I have met, and to be able to be a voice wherever I can for the disadvantaged. And I did work in a hospital for about 15 years too, and have family nurses and nursing home workers. So I guess it just runs in my blood.
Yeah, I can tell. I mean, it's obviously very personally, at a very genuine emotional level, very invested in not just the job, the vocation, the profession, the great work that you and the rest of the team at SEIU have been doing through many, many years, which is simply outstanding. What is there anything in particular? And look, I know this is the week when the news, the very horrible, tragic, heartbreaking, all of those words, those adjectives that are appropriate have been provided to describe the Canadian Armed Forces report, but not so much relating to the report itself, although for sure I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that. What have you been hearing from your members, from PSWs, over the last 12 weeks or even further back in terms of what they were seeing, they were feeling? I'm really curious to know what kinds of stories you're hearing from your members. What does it feel like for them on the ground, literally ground zero of the pandemic?
Yeah, over the last, 48, 50 some hours since that report, I've had to relive the last, whatever we're in, 12 weeks. And I myself am feeling like just this really heavy load on me right now. I mean, the report should not have surprised anybody, obviously, because it's been the situation for decades. But when I look back to what I hear constantly, and still today, I mean, a lot of those frontline workers are feeling a little bit of blame and targeting after that report as well, and they should not feel that way, but they do. Many times I get phone calls throughout the last weeks and throughout the last couple of days where these workers, like you said, predominantly women, are sobbing, like literally crying on the phone about what's happening in their lives. And when I go back and think of it at the beginning, the first phone calls were of fear, like, help us, we're not ready for this. The employers aren't addressing stuff like infection prevention and control. The PPEs was a problem. So they were calling for help very, very early. And when I recall that we had to fight even to get them to wear surgical masks at the beginning, and I would say, treat this as if everybody has the virus. And roll out the next couple of weeks. We found out that asymptomatic workers or society members, people can carry it. Now we're telling everybody as we open up the province, wear a mask. But 12 weeks ago, that was a no-no, that these workers themselves would be disciplined if they had a surgical mask on. So they continually cried. They were fearful and terrified of catching the virus themselves. I would wake up in the morning and get ready for my busy day and think of them every morning. They would wake up thinking or praying most of the time, and I did even pray with a lot of them, praying that, please God, don't let me get sick today. But then as they said goodbye to their loved ones, they prayed again on the way to work, don't let me bring the virus home and infect my family. And we saw a lot of that happen, that their families were infected. One even lost her husband because she infected him with COVID. So so the fear then turned to grief, which I think people don't understand either, is that these workers, those residents, they're like their family. Like, these are truly homes. The Premier calls them patients. They're not patients. They are residents that live in a home. So they become so attached to them that when all of these horrific deaths started to happen, and you would see dozens of bodies leave that home, they grieved as if it was their grandmother. And so did the residents grieve. And that was a story not told. Then as we fast forward, and we heard recently yesterday that there were many professions that were fearful of going in assisting or doing their jobs. Even funeral homes refused to go in because of the virus in there. So these personal support workers had to start preparing those, what they see as their loved ones, and watching the body bags leave after they prepared them. So grief, fear, sadness, it's all of that. I've prayed with and held these members as it went through, held them over the phone, obviously, but
Yeah, but still, no, that's absolutely horrifying. So, I have said throughout the last number of weeks that this is a time for all of us to rally together. It's not a time for crass partisanship or anything kind of over the top. People out there do not want to see any of us, and I say this as a political leader myself, playing politics with these issues. So I'm not doing it. And on this one in particular, there's absolutely no upside in going in that direction or playing it that way at all. But I do wonder, from your perspective, as someone who's in this every single day and has been for years, at a high level, I suppose, how did it come to this? I mean, I've heard people say in the past, before the pandemic, that long-term care as a sector is kind of like the forgotten sort of cousin, if I can put it that way, of our healthcare system. How did we in a country like ours, that's wealthy and prosperous and good standard of living, great quality of life, how did we end up in this situation? Where we see ourselves and our loved ones being so vulnerable to something like a pandemic. And just out of curiosity, have you seen other parts of the country or the world where this kind of issue, the aging question and how people can age with dignity and be safe and be healthy all the way through what are supposed to be their golden years, if there are places either across the continent, across North America or beyond, where they've gotten it right?
yeah, I mean, your first question, what led us to this? And I make no apologies, and the data's there. We have turned what I think a very compassionate service because you're right, seniors in their golden years, into a profit-making system. And
Right.
we all know that. I mean, these companies that run these homes are accountable to shareholders. And as you said, I've been doing this for decades. That's where this is turned to. And we should never, ever accept as Canadians that first priority for anybody taking care of our loved ones would be to pay shareholders, ever. So, I think an inquiry that we're asking for would obviously,
Yep.
hopefully point those things out. But, even early on, in Canada, take a look across our country. There's provinces that have had good outcomes. British Columbia, right away, the government took over immediately, managed those homes, and they did it right. And then even going forward, they are still going to oversee. They're going to be doing standard wages for these workers, which is also important, and to be able to have one full-time job. So that's a province that in our own
Yeah.
country that has done it well. And there's others, like you take a look at some of the European countries, they lead in a lot of labor relations issues and just good care, mental health and physical health of workers. And it all leads to how we treat these workers
Yeah.
results in the care that we give. So there's lots of examples that we can take a look at. Definitely. And early on in this one, I mean, we did try and meet with the government and remind them of some good examples that we should be replicating. And unfortunately, that didn't happen.
So on that point, because I did a similar thing, and I wasn't the only one, you and others across the system were strongly encouraging our government here in Ontario to look at the British Columbia example around, better compensation, making it far easier, or even requiring that workers don't go from one facility to the other, and all of that stuff. Any sense from your perspective about why here in Ontario we have lagged behind what British Columbia has done? Are you hearing or seeing anything that would help us understand why that's the case?
Well, the crisis here that we have with this sector, the personal support workers, we have a critical staffing shortage. And
Right.
that was apparent right away. And the fact that I had advised them to take a look at providing full-time work, because these women, predominantly women, as you said, they have to work more than one job. It's not uncommon to see them have two part-time jobs trying to seam together full-time jobs. So right away, I said, that is an issue in long-term care and home care. It's like that's a petri dish waiting to grow and spread. And I did recommend, as in BC, that immediately we provide all these workers with full-time work. If we
Yeah.
could do a universal wage so that they do not put any home at a disadvantage, because there is not a standard wage in this sector either. So when the workers were finally forced to choose one job, obviously two things factored into their decision. Where can I get the best and most wages?
Right.
And which company will treat me with the most respect and dignity? So
Right. Of course.
obviously that put some at a disadvantage. And the government knew that early, that if they did say one job, that there would be another crisis happening in some of these homes.
So, I know you're in this every day. It's your passion. It's the professional career, but it's more than just that for you. I know how important this is to you. I'm aware of it because of my time in government. But if there's somebody watching right now or listening to this conversation and they don't really have a firm grasp on what I'll call it the economic realities are for one of your members who happens to be working in this system, as we both said, mostly women, very often people of color, understanding fully that the job that PSWs are asked to take on is incredibly important, incredibly difficult, emotionally challenging at the best of times, even outside of a pandemic. I'm just curious, could you maybe paint a little bit of the economic picture for one of your average members, for somebody who just might not fully understand exactly how challenging it can be?
Right. As I said, the first thing is that they are unable to secure full-time work, which would provide them with some benefits. A lot of these women are single mothers as well. So, recently the conversation about paid sick days, and we did have that,
Yeah.
paid, and that's critically important in this sector, is that when people are sick, they have to be able to stay at home and get well and not spread whatever illness they have. But they can't afford to do that. They really can't. They are seaming together 3 jobs. So that's something that is a burden on them. It's not uncommon. I mean, the average annual rate, if you can get a full-time job in this sector, is around $35,000 a year.
Right.
Some of these workers get paid $14, $15 an hour, just over minimum wage. And that obviously contributes to the staffing crisis, because they are better off working at Tim Hortons, where they get $16 an hour, full-time job with benefits. So it is, it's poverty wages, absolutely.
And I'm assuming, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, that economic picture that you helped paint a second ago also makes it, I'm assuming, challenging for more people to be encouraged to come into the system. I mean, or into the profession. You talked about the staffing shortages. How much of a struggle is it to encourage people to consider a career as a personal support worker here in Ontario?
Well, as you mentioned, these women who died are in their mid-50s, and the average age of personal support workers is around that, 49 years old. So again, there is a forecasted crisis where, young people are not looking at this as a profession. They see the heavy, heavy work that it requires, but they also see the lack of respect and dignity that these people get. So we're having problems recruiting people to come into this. They do not see this as a profession that they want to go into, which should be alarming to all of us. We do not want to lose this profession at all. We actually want to enhance it, give it the respect that it needs, and include them in our whole healthcare team. So it is the conditions that are turning young people away from entering into this profession. And as a result of that, you're also seeing colleges, they're eliminating the programs even because they don't have enough enrollment. So that is a crisis in and of itself.
So how do that last thing you talked about, or the second last thing, finding a way to elevate the notion of the profession of the trade, or the role of personal support worker, how do we do that? What's the best way for government, for the union, for whoever has to be at the table, whatever partner is at the table to help make that happen? What's your best suggestion on how to make that happen?
Well, basically give the ones that are working there what they've been asking for years. We really have to reform the entire service of long-term care, the industry, the care that's given. We need to make it attractive. People go into this profession for life if they can. It's a calling. They're very, very special. We need to reform it, give it the whole sector the respect and dignity, the wages that it deserves. Take a look, again, I'm going to continually repeat, take a look at, is this what we want? Do we want profits being made out of this, or do we want to truly take care of people and attract and retain people who want to give that care? Because they are very special people that want to go into this.
Right, for sure. So in the Canadian Armed Forces report that came out earlier this week, was there anything in that report that was surprising to you or to your members? Anything at all?
No, really. I mean, when people say what surprised you about that report, what surprised me the most is the reaction of people who knew exactly what was going to come out of that report.
Right.
That frustrated the heck out of me, how people said, oh, I'm so surprised, I didn't know about this. Well, the last 10 weeks, those frontline workers have been calling on it. I've been reporting what they are telling me is happening in real time. So absolutely. I mean, I had heard about some of the management not being in there, and that was, alarming to have that, alleged to be verified in that. But again, Stephen, public inquiry will definitely identify if those are truly as horrific as we see in that report, but who's responsible for what, who didn't do what. I mean, it alarms me too. How fast did people act on those issues when they were reported? So, yeah.
And so they looked at five homes, 5 long-term care homes across the province in the Canadian Armed Forces report. Do you think that is, if you had to, with the knowledge you have, what you hear in terms of feedback from your members, if you had to give a sense of, is that the tip of the iceberg? Does it reflect 10% of what we have out there of the more than 600 facilities? Is it 20%, 50%, or is it just a sort of a patchwork? It's all over the place and there's no consistent kind of standard, if you had to give us a sense?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. There is no consistent standard, which we absolutely need more of. The staffing levels is something that we have to take a look at, and levels of care, which we had started to work on some time ago, the 4 hours of care. But is that isolated to those 5 homes? We would be extremely naive to believe anybody saying that it is.
Right.
I could list you off 15 right now, and even the next day, they identified more that needed managing. So no, it is not limited to those 5 at all. It is more, unfortunately, common than it is not.
So you've called for, and you were one of the first to call for a full independent public inquiry. I've called for it. Other political leaders have. The government's made an announcement since all of those calls to do what they're calling an independent commission, if I'm not mistaken. That's what they're calling it, to start in the fall. I've certainly said to media, look, that might seem like progress, but it does still fall short of the full public inquiry that we're looking for. I'm just wondering, what's your take on the notion of a commission versus a public inquiry, and do you see? I haven't seen it yet, but do you see any or have any sense coming from government that they are looking perhaps to change their minds? I've urged the Premier to do it. It's never the wrong time to make the right decision, I keep saying. So go to a full public inquiry. Let's get right to the root of this. But I'm just wondering what your take is: commission versus public inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely disappointed, and I continually to ask, why not just go there? Yesterday, he moved up the commission to July, which is a good thing. I mean, I was outraged that we would wait till September to do any kind of an investigation. So thankfully, the Armed Forces report has put a fire under that. But as you say, you and I know the difference between a commission and an inquiry. The inquiry has its own act that clearly outlines and defines what authority and decision-making powers that an inquiry has. And to start off, it has an appointment of a judge, which should be an independent, not biased, non-partisan judge. And he or she needs to have the power to call witnesses, to be able to get people to testify, be able to have the power to open books, call documents, call budgets, all of that. And the most important thing is that government influence is not seen anywhere in that.
Right.
If Mr. Ford stands up and says that he can guarantee that that will happen, then I ask, why not just go straight to the public inquiry? Not try to mix the authority of an inquiry into a commission, just do the inquiry.
Yeah, I know, and that's exactly what I've said as well. I've been a little bit surprised that they haven't as of yet anyway made the decision to go in that direction. I think, and this is how I've said it. Again, this is not a partisan comment at all. I think if we collectively want to find a way to restore confidence in the system, in the long-term care system, in the whole question relating to how people age with dignity in our province, I think the best way to do it is just go straight to the public inquiry, be as transparent as possible, acknowledge that there will be criticisms of how the system's being managed, not just in the last 2 years, although there have been instances of mismanagement for sure in the last 2 years, but over the course of a very long stretch of time, because to me, that is the best way to actually come up with a clear roadmap for where we have to go next. And I'm sincerely hopeful that they will see the light on this one and move this to a public inquiry. Throughout the pandemic so far, when you're talking to your members, and I know you touched upon how you talk to them over the phone or at a distance in person and you've grieved with them, is there one particularly compelling story that you heard from one of your members that is something that will kind of stay with you forever, regardless of what comes next in long-term care? Is there anything in particular that jumps out at you, one particular story or a sense of how somebody's felt on those front lines that will really help capture it for people in Ontario who just don't know? Because, lots of us, my parents are getting a bit older. They're still living at home. They're still healthy at home, thank goodness. So in my own family, we don't have any direct experience recently in a long-term care facility, and quite a few Ontarians don't. I'm just wondering if there's one story you could present to us that would really help reinforce the overall tragedy and challenge that exists in the system right now.
Well, excuse me. There's a combination. The one thing that has really impacted me over the weeks is the stories of those 3 women who died. Many of them were PSWs for almost 3 decades, definitely over 2, some 24, some over 30 years. And I would talk to one in particular before her death, and they were all crying and asking for personal support or personal protective equipment.
Right.
All three of them tell that story. There was one, the most recent was Sharon Roberts. Her story is just, and it's heartbreaking, but yet it's so common. She and her colleagues at where she worked did an action on their own. They sat in the kitchen. They did not refuse to go. They didn't refuse to work, but they sat in the kitchen and said, because the outbreaks were outrageous in that home, and they said, we are not going to continue to work with these COVID positive residents until we have N95 masks.
Right.
And they got them. They gave it to them. They had the masks, but unfortunately, Sharon didn't know that she could have possibly been infected herself then. And only a few days later, she did get her test back that she was positive. Sharon's story is that she obviously is a woman of color. She migrated to Canada, a single woman, which is common. She lived alone, and she had friends. A lot of her friends were her coworkers, but no family outside of that or friends outside of that. So she was alone. She had a cousin that lived in New York who was like a sister, and she would talk to her regularly. Sharon spoke to her cousin about how sick she was and that she had tested positive. And as her condition was rapidly progressing worse, her cousin said, make sure that you're eating. They had a friend come over and give her soup. And she said, go to bed, take your Advil, Tylenol, go to bed and try and get better. And she didn't hear back from Sharon. So her cousin from New York had to call the Toronto police to get them to go into the home to see if Sharon was all right. And they found her deceased in the home. And then, of course, trying to do the work with her family over the next couple of weeks. But that story just hit me, and it's not uncommon. Like, the stories of these women and their faces need to be told more too. But that one sticks to me a lot, and that is something that we see often. They're alone, they migrate to Canada. I think in some conditions that makes them vulnerable to be exploited the way that we also see them. And then another one too, in a different area in Toronto, she had underlying health conditions. She had asthma. So, again, because they're so dedicated to their work in these residents, she continued to go to work because she knew there was a staffing shortage.
Right.
She asked for the N95 mask, did not get it because they would not give it to the workers. So she went out and bought her own to keep herself safe. She had asthma. She was disciplined for wearing that N95 mask and told to take it off. And many times when they did bring in their own masks, they were told to take them off. So those stories, there's reasons for this, why the employers told them not to wear the N95 masks, but those stories will stick with me for a long time. The conditions that we heard, I've known for decades, so that we live with and we fight to get better. But these stories will impact me for a long time.
Those stories are very hard to listen to and very hard to hear, and it's hard to imagine that even outside of a pandemic or a crisis, that those could be the circumstances in which your members and the residents of those facilities find themselves in. But particularly in the midst of a pandemic crisis, it's shocking, I think, and heartbreaking to hear that that this is what's occurred in this day and age. Out of curiosity, we didn't touch upon it earlier, but it's the second or third time you've mentioned it in our conversation today. Why would your members be disciplined for wearing masks in the middle of a pandemic when there's lots of information out there? And there was, from virtually the very beginning, that personal protective equipment was essential for, I'm not a healthcare expert, I'm just an everyday Ontarian, but surely it's understood, or should be understood, by those in positions of authority that you'd want to protect both the residents and the workers from the spread of the virus. So what's at the root of disciplining someone from wearing a mask to protect themselves and the resident?
Well, the excuses given to us is because of the shortage of N95 masks, and that is exactly what these workers should be wearing in these homes. They are dealing with very close contact. Seniors, they say that it has to be aerosol generated procedures to require an N95 mask. But these seniors, again, they are heavy care now because they are living longer. So mobility issues are really a issue in here. But you're in very close contact with residents who sneeze and cough and spit. So, you know, there you go. And they have tested positive with COVID. So the workers were asking for N95 masks. There's a shortage of them, whether or not, or at least they claimed that there was a shortage of them early, which we wanted to work with them on and didn't get that opportunity to do so. But they wanted these N95 masks, and the employers were saying, no, you cannot use them, because if they did, was there going to be an expectation then that the whole home should be wearing these masks, and they were not willing to provide them with those masks. We recently were fortunate enough to obtain about 400 N95 masks from a company that was donating them to conquer COVID, actually. Right. So we were able to get some from them, and we distributed them to people like the member that I told you had the asthma, and saying, look, your life is at risk. We're going to hand these out to you. Obviously, they had to be the right sizes and everything. We did everything right. Within half an hour of handing those out, we get a call from the employer saying, stop it. If you've got N95 masks, give them to us so that we can distribute them. Well, that's the last thing we were going to do, because what we found out is they're locked up. The companies are hoarding them. They're not giving them out. They are there. What they're holding them for, that I guess we'll find out in an inquiry if we have one. But that is it. They would not give these masks to these workers, and I will support them and argue that N95s were absolutely required in this environment of care, where hundreds and thousands of residents were infected with COVID.
So now for several weeks, we've heard at his daily media availabilities, press conferences, the Premier has been asked about personal protective equipment on the front lines in long-term care. And he has said on more than one occasion over the last several weeks that we, as in Ontario, we have all the PPE that's sufficient and is needed. All someone has to do is call. Those are, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially been his message. Just call the government, just call us and we can get you what you need. My position on that has been that I don't think it's good enough for the government in the middle of a pandemic to be reactive. Workers on the front lines have this need. We know the need exists. The government has the capacity to be more proactive. But out of curiosity, in any conversations that you or SEIU or your members might have had with government officials or even MPPs, was there ever a sense that sufficient PPE was in fact available or easy to access? Or was there a bit of a breakdown in communication there as well?
Well, I agree with you. You shouldn't have to call up. They should be proactive and supply them. But yes, all the way through the last 3 months, there's been enormous communications breakdown from every single organization you can name, public health, even the chief medical officer, a breakdown and inconsistent communication and messaging right from day one. But yeah, my members would call and say, we need these N95s. Like I said, they would call and cry and plead. And I'd say, well, we're hearing that there's a shortage, and they said, well, the Premier's saying, just call me up. So actually I directed them, then call them if that's what he's saying. But yeah, mixed messages. I'm just recently finding out from the employers that they do have them, but they're locked up. They're not going to hand them out. And yet you talk to, some staff in the government, and they're saying there is a shortage. Well, it's now 3 months. We're having conversations about, what about domestic productions of these things? Why? We're so late on everything. And early on, you could see this freight train start coming down the tracks. We should never have been unprepared for this. And if we did have a shortage, which you could appreciate, maybe it's a worldwide pandemic, and there's a high demand for it, but again, why weren't we more proactive on this? We knew it was happening. And I think it's inexcusable too that, millions of N95 masks were allowed to expire. That's something that I'd like the inquiry to look into too. How can those things happen? So
right.
Yeah, miscommunication.
So you say miscommunication, but have the lines of communication been open? Have you heard from, or your members or others in similar positions, have you heard from the government? Is there a reasonable flow of information back and forth, or is it being difficult, inconsistent?
Oh, difficult. Absolutely difficult. I've lost total confidence in the communications that we're getting from the government. literally between hours, the message can change. And we've seen that over the last few days with the response to the Armed Forces report. So yeah, and that has to be much better. And early on, Stephen, not just SEIU, but all the healthcare unions met with both ministries, warned them because we know what's going on in the front line, reminded them of the SARS recommendations early. And when they said to us that there was a shortage of PPE, okay, if that is the case, which that wasn't what we were hearing on the front line, then let's start working together about cohorting, right? Like, let's talk about stuff like that. No, they just, nod their head, they hear us, but never, ever any action. And I can go back chronologically and say, we asked for managing of these homes, those 5 weeks ago. We were told, the public was told, we don't have the authority to do that. Yesterday or the day before, he found the authority. Like, all of this, just words would come out of people's mouths, tears would come out of their eyes, but yet no action would come out of anywhere once those things were done. So yeah, communication was not consistent, was not reliable, and didn't have confidence in what we were hearing anyway.
Right. So when you look at the long-term care sector here in Ontario today, and you would understand that, there's a significant amount of the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, if I'm putting them all under one sort of title, under one ministry title, there is a significant amount of money that gets invested here in Ontario in long-term care every year. Is your perspective that one of the challenges we're facing is the amount that we invest in long-term care, in that it needs to grow, or is it how we're investing the resources that we already allocate, or that we already budget for long-term care, or is it both? There needs to be more, and it needs to be allocated in a more effective way, in a more fair way.
It has to be both.
Okay.
Definitely, there needs to be more resources in here, but again, I say there has to be accountability to where that money is going and where it's being put to. Yourself, that the long-term care gets 2 envelopes of the public purse, and one of them is nursing, the other is for others, meaning hiring cooks and housekeepers, all non-nursing issues, including supplies, like you saw in the report, the briefs and other issues like that. When you have got the very limited amount of money going into this industry, and yet you've got so much of it being taken out to pay shareholders of these for-profit companies, I guess if we ever could get into the books and the reality of where that money is going to, we might find out that there in fact is enough money. You take off, and again, just recently at the Extended Care General Membership meeting, the fact that they only put in $300,000 of their own money and yet paid out tens of millions to shareholders during this period of the pandemic. Yeah, I mean, maybe we do have enough money. It's just going into shareholders' hands instead of the care of our seniors.
Right. Do you think that most of the authority and responsibility and capacity exists so that, a provincial government can fix most of what's required? Do you see more of a partnership between a federal and a provincial government? Do you think it's time for some sort of national standard? I'm just curious how you think all those pieces kind of fit together. There's stuff in the news just today about this whole notion that, actually provinces like Ontario do have a ton of capacity at their disposal should they choose to use it. There have been calls previously for national standards. Just wondering where, what you think the most effective way is to get all of us into a better place in long-term care here in Ontario.
I do think that there's a partnership. And I mean, there somewhat is now, because, the health transfer dollars come from the federal government. And again, there has to be, follow the money practice here. There has to be regulations. I do believe that there should be national standards. I mean, these companies are multinational companies, so the oversight of a national body should be something that we all welcome. Regulations and standards have to be much stronger, and the partnership between the two should be there. The only thing is I'll use the pandemic pay for example. Great support, workers needed it. The government provided, I think it was 75% of that, the province 25%. When I talked to the Prime Minister about that, I said, my experience is that if you put the money in the hands of these corporations, which eventually it goes from feds to the provincial to the employers, my experience is that the workers do not get all of that money. And what they announced that April 24th, and they still have not seen that money on their checks. Now, it was announced a few days ago that, okay, we're ready to hand it out. And there's still problems with it because they're not encompassing all professions. But where are we on today? The end of May, and just a handful have found that on their check. So that's you have to follow the money.
Yeah, out of curiosity, they didn't contemplate a direct transfer to the employees. I mean, I'm guessing that from a systems perspective, a lot of, I guess they didn't look at it that way.
Well, I mean, the rationale was legitimate. I mean, my world is healthcare workers, but essential service workers, there's a lot of them out there. So, yes.
So this has all been very informative and very, very helpful. I think as we come to a close, I would ask, is there one particular message or theme, if you could share with the public here in Ontario, regarding not only where we find ourselves today, and not only uncovering where we should have known better for many years, but most importantly, if there's one clear message or theme on the go forward, on what that plan needs to look like, or that roadmap needs to look like, if there is one message around all of that that you could share with our viewers today, what would it be?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm so desperately hanging on to hope here, because we have been in this situation before. There's been so many reports and W5 documentations about the conditions in long-term care. When I'm asked what I'm hopeful of, I'm hopeful that the public will stay with us in this fight. Whether or not you have family in long-term care, you may someday have family. We ourselves may someday require those services. We all need to demand that we do better for the residents, for those special people that take care of them. So I'm hopeful that people will demand the change that's required here, and we need total reform in here. We've touched on some topics, but those are just very few. There's so much more to talk about. So my hope is that people will stay on this. As we open up the province and the weather turns nice and the curve is flattening, it may very quickly reappear, and all of us can do better than this. I use the saying, it takes a village. This truly, truly does. And that's where my confidence lies today in the public, that we will make this happen.
Well, that's a great message. And I really appreciate, Sharleen, you taking the time to be with me here today for our conversation and for participating in our REDtalks series, our first one on what is the most critically important issue right now that we are grappling with here in this province. And so I want to thank you, of course, for sharing the time and for the incredible stories that you have relayed to us. But I also want you to know from me, through you, to your members, to your workers, I want to say thank you for the incredible work that they have been doing as heroes during the pandemic on the front lines, but historically doing the kind of work. I was close to all four of my grandparents, and I had them through most of my childhood, my young adulthood, and I had a chance to see how personal support workers have a direct and positive impact in the most vulnerable moments for our parents and grandparents. It is exceptional work, and it needs to be valued. It needs to be compensated properly. And I think what you said a little bit earlier in the conversation today about how long-term care and the work that's done in long-term care needs to become, I'll say, more of an equal partner within the overarching healthcare system. I think you're bang on about that. And I sincerely hope that your members will know that their work matters to me, it matters to Ontarians, and that they are being seen and they are being heard. It is horrible, it's horrifying to me that it's taken this kind of crisis and the Armed Forces report to elevate it to this point. But I think it's now a responsibility that we all share to make sure that we get it right going forward. And I want to make sure that your workers do feel safe and secure, and continue to feel that way each and every day. And as a politician, as a political leader, that is my commitment to you and my commitment to your membership and to the people that they care for in Ontario's long-term care homes and beyond. So Thank you once again for joining me, and thank you so much for the work that you are doing.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll deliver that message for sure. And it was a real honor and privilege to be on your first REDtalks. Good luck with that.
Thank you, Charlene. You take care and stay healthy, please.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.